In June of 1812, the United States declared war upon Great Britain, initiating a little-known conflict that was to drag on for the next 2.5 years. It was a strange war that the majority of people on both sides did not want, and certainly one that neither side was prepared for. For an entire generation, the focus of the American people had been fighting the land, hacking farms and towns out of the wilderness. Indeed, the war was so unpopular in the northeastern states that church bells rang out in mourning on learning of the declaration. The US Army was a small token force, not much regarded. It was supplemented by enormous numbers of militia that would fiercely defend their homes, but had little interest in fighting anywhere else. In contrast, the British had a substantial army of well-trained professional soldiers, but unfortunately most of them were in Europe fighting the French, the Napoleonic Wars at that time reaching their climax. The garrison of British North America, as Canada was called at the time, came to no more than 5,000 troops. As for militia, the Canadian civilian population was acutely aware of the odds, and defeatism was rampant, even amongst extreme loyalists. In any case, there were no weapons or uniforms for them. It was to be a war of small make-do forces, patchily trained and equipped, scrabbling in terrible conditions to make and check attacks over huge distances. At this time, most of the border was still virgin forest. There weren't even many roads. Most of the population lived in small isolated villages of 200 to 300 people, connected by tracks that turned into mud in the spring thaw and were overgrown by late summer. By far the quickest and most efficient way to move troops and supplies around was by water, so the key to successful military operations on the border lay in control of the Great Lakes. At the start of the war, the British had naval superiority on Lake Erie, by virtue of having 2 fighting vessels against only 1 American. They had taken the initiative and seized Detroit, dispersing an American army and garrisoning the place with infantry and guns. This boosted morale, rallied the Indians, and secured the western frontier. To successfully counterattack, the Americans needed to challenge the British ships, and so they commenced a building program at the Navy Yard at Black Rock and a new base at Presque Isle by the town of Erie. Progress was initially slow. The few ships at Black Rock were pinned down by British batteries, and it took some time for facilities at Presque Isle to be set up. In March of 1813, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry was appointed to command, and he hurried the work along. Once the yards were ready, construction of new ships was rapid, many corners being cut. As Perry said of his new fleet, all they have to do is fight and win one battle. He managed to haul and sail the existing gunboats from Black Rock to reinforce the ships being built at Presque Isle. By the end of July, Perry had a squadron of 9 vessels. His biggest problem was a shortage of crew. Although there were 100,000 registered sailors in the USA, most were on the coasts and few had combat experience. Perry was constantly petitioning for more men, and he took them from wherever he could, although at least 50 sailors from the famous USS Constitution, at that time in refit, were temporarily transferred to his command. To save time, the bulk of the American squadron was made up of the kind of small schooners and sloops that were normally employed as merchants on the lakes, and which therefore the shipwrights were very familiar with. Indeed, 3 of them were actually converted merchants. They were all about 65 to 75 feet in length, 60 to 70 tons displacement, rigged fore and aft with triangular lateen sails, and armed with either 1 or 2 heavy cannon mounted on pivots. There were also 3 brigs, 2 massive vessels with square-rigged sails. The smallest, the Caledonia, was an ex-British merchant ship captured at the start of the war. The other 2, the sister ships Lawrence and Niagara, were at the time the largest vessels ever constructed on Lake Erie, attracting large numbers of gawping well-wishers when launched. They were 110 feet long and displaced nearly 500 tons, and heavily armed with 2 12-pounder long guns and 18 32-pounder carronades. Such heavy armament is a function of fighting on fresh water. Although Lake Erie is some 10,000 square miles in size, nowhere is a ship more than 1 day's sailing from land, or 2 days from a friendly port, which reduces the need to carry provisions. Water doesn't have to be carried at all, one can simply stick a bucket over the side. Heavy copper bottoming on the hull is unnecessary because the wood-boring teredo worm is a saltwater species. It can't survive in fresh water. Doing without copper bottoming frees up even more displacement for weapons. All this meant that, in comparison to a similarly sized ocean-going warship, its counterpart on Lake Erie could have 30 to 35% more firepower. The British naval supremacy was based on two modestly sized ships belonging to an organisation called the Provincial Marine. Originally a British Army transport service, it had evolved into a kind of naval militia, responsible for custom duties and general patrolling. Just after the start of the war, a third vessel, a very large schooner called the Lady Provost, was launched. The British also converted 3 captured merchant vessels, arming them in the same way as the Americans. Their commander was Robert Heriot Barclay, a one-armed veteran of Trafalgar who only arrived in June. He was even worse off for crew than Perry was, having just 60 Royal Navy sailors to supplement 100 semi-professionals from the Provincial Marine. The balance of his requirements had to be made up with soldiers from local infantry regiments. These were experienced warriors, but they were not sailors. They weren't even Marines. Nonetheless, in spite of these disadvantages, Barclay energetically reconnoitred the lake, attempted, and failed, to intercept the ships moving from Black Rock, and then settled down to blockade Presque Isle. With the town of Erie providing large numbers of militia, forts blocking the land approaches, and a long sandbar across the harbour entrance, Presque Isle was near enough impregnable. But the sandbar that prevented the British attacking also worked to prevent Perry's large brigs from leaving. However, the British could not maintain the blockade indefinitely, and they were forced to retire to reprovision. Perry immediately lightened Lawrence and Niagara by removing their guns, then floated them over the sandbar, and then refitted their cannon. This process was not complete when the British squadron returned, but Perry boldly lined up his smaller vessels, and being unaware that the large American brigs were only partially rearmed, Barclay retired back to Amhertsburg. He was awaiting completion of a large vessel of his own. Perry was thus able to sail and established an anchorage at Put-in Bay, an island in the western part of the lake. From here he was able to effectively carry out a long-range blockade of Detroit. The town was filled with refugees, Indians fleeing Harrison's seek and destroy missions in the territory. These people were consuming British supplies at an alarming rate. With provisions running low, and with winter drawing near when foraging would be impossible, Barclay was forced to seek a decisive battle to break the siege. He sailed as soon as his new sloop, the Detroit, was ready. Detroit was slightly smaller than the American brigs, but very well made. Unfortunately, her originally intended armament had been captured by the Americans, so instead she had been fitted out with a hodgepodge of different cannon from the British border forts, many of them in poor condition. Nonetheless, she was still the most powerful vessel in the British squadron. Their only other major unit was the ex-Provincial Marine ship, the Queen Charlotte. Overall, the British were heavily outpowered. They were outnumbered, 6 vessels against 9. They were considerably outtunned, about 1,100 to 1,500. They were outmanned, about 440 crew to 550. And although they actually had more cannon, the American guns were much bigger, throwing a much heavier weight of shot. But as they put out on the morning of 10th September, they did at least have the advantage of the wind, even if it was very light. Barclay knew that his best chance was to use this to manoeuvre so that he could mass his ships against only 1 or 2 of the enemy in turn, defeating them in detail. Perry was fully aware of this tactic, and he instructed his captains to closely engage set enemy ships, thus swamping the British and preventing them from ganging up on individual American vessels. He intended his flagship, the Lawrence, to engage the British flagship, Detroit, the Niagara to engage Queen Charlotte, and the minor vessels to engage the smaller British ships. The Americans sailed as soon as they sighted the British squadron. Both sides were arrayed in a line of battle, with the larger ships in the middle. As they closed, the wind suddenly shifted to the southwest, giving the Americans the weather gauge and allowing them to attack. As per his plan, Perry headed Lawrence directly towards Detroit, but in the light wind progress was slow, and Lawrence was peppered by the assortment of guns on the British flagship for some time before being able to effectively reply. Moreover, behind Perry his plan was beginning to go awry. Niagara was slow in getting into action. It is unclear exactly why. Captain Jesse Elliot may have been confused or upset because Perry had expected Queen Charlotte to lead the British formation, and had therefore put Elliot in the lead of the American squadron. When it turned out Detroit was in front, Perry had hurriedly reorganised, putting Lawrence ahead of Niagara. Elliot blamed signalling problems, and also claimed he had been slowed by the ship in front of him, the Caledonia. It is certainly true that Caledonia, by far the oldest vessel in the battle that day, was a notoriously slow sailor. Whatever the reason, the slow pace of the American assault enabled Queen Charlotte to move up and support Detroit, and under the combined fire of the two and other British ships, Lawrence was soon reduced to a wreck, 2/3 of her crew casualties and every gun knocked out. It was at this point that Perry hauled down his personal standard, took to a boat, and had himself rowed to the Niagara. The paintings show Perry heroically standing in the boat, flag waving defiantly. In actual fact, his exit would have been much more hurried. His boat was spotted by the British, who divined instantly what he was doing and fired at him. Once on Niagara, Perry took personal command and led her forward into the battle. Elliot similarly took to a boat and went to rally the smaller American vessels, now lagging in the rear. Although Lawrence had been wrecked, the British were also in a bad way. Both Detroit and Queen Charlotte had been significantly damaged. Lady Prevost had been disabled and was drifting downwind, and most importantly of all, most of the officers had been killed or wounded. When the British saw the fresh Niagara heading towards them, they attempted to turn to get their undamaged sides to face the attack. But due to the damage they had taken, and the loss of command and control, Detroit and Queen Charlotte fouled each other while attempting this manoeuvre. Perry was therefore able to bring Niagara into a raking position on the two ships' bows, while the smaller American schooners clustered to their sterns, doing horrific and increasingly unanswerable damage. By Herculean efforts the British managed to get themselves untangled, but they were by then incapable of further resistance. Both struck soon after, followed by two of the smaller British ships. The last two tried to escape, but were run down and captured. The battle had lasted just under 4 hours. Apart from the loss of all of their ships, British casualties came to 134 killed and wounded and 306 captured. The Americans suffered 123 killed and wounded, almost all of them on Lawrence. This decisive American victory completely altered the strategic situation. Total naval superiority on Lake Erie secured the West and prevented any British counterattack for the rest of the war. More immediately, without any chance of resupply, the British were forced to abandon Detroit and evacuate the Thames River region. The Americans used their ships to ferry guns and supplies quickly, and they caught up with the exhausted, half-starved British force and shattered it at the Battle of the Thames. Most significantly, the inspirational native leader Tecumseh was killed in the fight, and combined with the cutting of the British supply lines, this effectively knocked the Indians out of the war. Perry was much lauded for his victory, tributes that he heartily deserved, and many towns and locations are named after him. However, the acclaim was marred by the odd behaviour of Jesse Elliot, whose recalcitrance led to unfounded accusations of cowardice. Elliot felt compelled to defend himself, and this led to an unseemly exchange of letters in the press, and eventually the issuing of a challenge to a duel, which thankfully never took place. Perry, whose health had been fragile even before the war, died in Trinidad in 1819. Elliot pursued the feud even after that, to the ruination of his reputation. Robert Barclay, who had been wounded 4 more times in the battle, was court-martialed but absolved of any responsibility for the defeat, which the presiding officers put down to American numerical superiority, a shortage of trained sailors, and the early loss of many senior officers. He was pensioned off and given only a minor command before his death in 1837. The only surviving ship of the Battle of Lake Erie is USS Niagara. She was deliberately sunk at the end of the war to preserve her, raised in 1913 and progressively restored from the 1930s through to the 1960s. In the late 1980s she was found to be in extremely poor condition and essentially rebuilt. Original timbers and fittings were used as much as possible, but so much new material was used that many people consider that the tourist attraction now floating on Lake Erie is actually a replica. Still, going on board does still give a very good impression of what life on these ships must have been like.